It's a wipeout, and it's a narco-terrorism to take over the entire criminal network.
Their business is the business of death, and it's a lucrative business of death.
The reaction was almost certainly for me more frightening than the actual initial attack, than the Regency Hotel. That was a sign of what was to come, and it was only the start of what has been a slaughter.
What we can predict with certainty is that our activity will continue in an unrelenting manner.
There was a child's bedroom in the house. The child wasn't in the bedroom, but they threw a petrol bomb in, didn't light it, but just said, we know where the child is, that's what we can do.
We're living in a lawless society, effectively, where you're more likely to go to jail for not having a TV licence than you are for being a member of a gang.
In February 2016, a gang of 5 burst into the Regency Hotel in North Dublin during a boxing weigh-in. 3 were disguised as members of the emergency response unit. 1 was wearing a flat cap and another was dressed as a woman. They entered the venue and opened fire. Their intended target was international crime cartel boss Daniel Kinahan. It's alleged the man dressed as a woman searching the venue for Daniel Kinahan is Patrick Hutch, a nephew of Gerry the Monk Hutch. Daniel Kinahan managed to escape out the back of the venue, but key Kinahan gang member David Byrne was not so lucky. The 34-year-old was fleeing the weigh-in with everyone else when one of the armed men recognised him and shot him in the hotel lobby. He crawled to the reception desk and a second gunman fired more bullets into him, finishing the job. The father of 2 was shot up to 6 times. The gang fled the scene within minutes. Their mission to kill Daniel Kinahan had failed. Christy Kinahan's eldest son hid behind a car before making good his escape. Ireland's bloodiest gang feud had begun. The brazen nature of the Regency attack shocked the country and made headlines around the globe. The fact that this planned execution could happen in broad daylight in a well-known hotel with members of the media at the scene led to serious questions being asked about why the Gardaí weren't on standby and their seeming lack of intelligence around this well-publicised boxing event, which was bound to attract key gangland figures. It triggered an all-out bloody war between the Kinahan and the Hutch factions, leaving 14 dead. But with 12 Hutch associates dead and only 2 Kinahan affiliates murdered, the feud is distinctly one-sided. In Dublin's north inner city, locals and experts working in the community spoke about their sense of shock at the violence and the audacity of the Regency attack.
Everybody was really, really shocked, and nobody would have ever expected something like that to happen in a hotel just down the road from us. I think the horror of what happened with young people there, particularly children that were going to a sporting event, that they would be exposed to that kind of trauma in Dublin was pretty shocking, and people were very upset. But the reality of what it actually meant for the future going forward, most people didn't ever expect it to go as far as it's gone.
Unfortunately, it proved to be a catalyst for a catalogue of tragedies, and the initial fear was proven to be true. The way it was done, and the audacious way, and the sort of blatant and the almost theatrical way it was done, really sparked off this circle of violence that we've had to put up with for the last 2 years.
When you looked at the footage of it, particularly, of a military-style attack being carried out in a Dublin North hotel at a boxing weigh-in, I think it sent a signal that the game had been upped and that there was going to be serious ramifications for that, particularly when the target wasn't got and a lesser member of the gang was assassinated.
Everybody was nearly had a sense of an impending explosion coming. You were just waiting for it to kick off. I don't think anybody thought it was going to happen as quickly, as efficiently and as frighteningly as it did.
The Regency attack was sparked by the murder months beforehand of 34-year-old Gerry Hutch. The older sibling of Patrick Hutch was shot dead in Spain in September 2015. He had been working for the Kinahan drug gang, but the cartel believed he was involved in a botched hit on Daniel Kinahan in 2014 on the Costa del Sol. Over a number of months, Gerry Hutch negotiated with the Kinahans in a bid to spare his nephew's life. The monk handed over around €200,000 by way of compensation, but the Kinahans killed Gerry Hutch anyway. 4 months later at the Regency Hotel, the Hutches hit back and the deadliest gang war to take place on our shores began. It soon became clear the Kinahans had the upper hand. 3 days after the Regency attack, the Kinahans retaliated by gunning down Eddie Hutch Sr. at his home on Poplar Row in Dublin's north inner city. The taxi man and father of 5 was the brother of Gerry the Monk Hutch. Carrying Eddie's coffin, his nephews Gareth Hutch at the front on the left and Derek Coakley Hutch on the right would soon become victims of the feud. The following month, in March 2016, close friend of the monk, cigarette smuggler Noel Duggan, is executed outside his home in a housing estate in Watoath, County Meath.
Any time that a man is shot down in his own driveway in front of, where his family were inside in the house, that is a barbaric act.
From a warfare point of view, the Kinahan side have clocked up more victims, but their victims are largely not significant figures within the Hutch faction. We have had friends, we've had nephews, relatives, people who are very small-time criminals are not involved at all. They've all been easy targets by and large.
In April 2016, Martin O'Rourke is shot dead on Sheriff Street in the inner city in a case of mistaken identity. The intended target was one of the Hutches. Later the same month, 35-year-old Michael Barr was shot dead at the Sunset House pub by Kinahan gunmen wearing Freddy Krueger masks. They believed that he sourced the weapons used during the Regency attack.
In the initial stages, people would have expected that the Hutches would have immediately hit back and dealt with this and neutralised the threat, particularly in their own area, in their own patch, whatever about the south side, where they weren't really strong. But here, in what's now being called Ground Zero, they would have held, they would have been the people and the biggest crime gang.
In May that year, Gareth Hutch, the monk's nephew, was shot dead in broad daylight as he made his way to his car that morning outside the flat complex where he lived. This footage shows the 2 attackers opening fire on the father of one before they fled the scene.
Gareth Hutch had made an appointment to come into my office to discuss what I believed to be a usual constituency matter. So during the course of the conversation, Gareth explained the problem he had, that he had received the Garda note to say his life was in danger. He was fearful that there was access to his flat where there was a blind spot not covered by CCTV in the complex. And throughout the whole conversation, and this is what always resonates with me and stays with me, he was only concerned about his son. He actually said to me at one stage, "They can get me, but I have to protect my son."
As the death toll rose, the public outcry became deafening and the government came under pressure to intervene.
It is, at this particular point in time, Taoiseach, out of control. And I'm going to put it to you, Taoiseach, do you accept my point about the multidimensional nature to this? It's not just one issue on its own, but it needs, and I ask you, it really needs the government to take a specific, focused, out of the normal response to the north inner city area to free the people there.
This is a dispute between 2 families, and it's a vicious, murderous dispute. And I don't think that I can stop that. But I think that from the government point of view, we can provide the resources and the wherewithal that the Commissioner of the Gardaí needs to have her forces deal with this in the way that they have to. Now, I'm quite prepared, Deputy Martin, to accept that things are different than they were 20 years ago. But I'd like, with the Minister for Justice, to see to it that we meet with those communities and demonstrate to them that the government are serious about their protection.
In August 2016, another innocent victim falls prey to the feud. Dublin City Council worker Trevor O'Neill is shot dead in Majorca while on a family holiday with his wife and young children. He was mistaken for Jonathan Hutch, a nephew of the monk, who was also on the island at the time. Although the hit was botched, it proved the Kinahans' reach extended far beyond North Dublin. And in December, Noel Duckegg Kerwin, a very close friend of Gerry Hutch, is shot dead outside his home in West Dublin. He attended the funeral of Gerry Hutch's brother Eddie and was targeted simply because of his close friendship with the monk.
It has been a very one-sided feud. And while we continue to call it a feud, it's not really that. It never has been. Perhaps ethnic cleansing is a way to describe it.
In 2017, 2 more men on either side of this bloody war were added to the list of victims. On the 31st of May, Michael Keogh was gunned down, only the second Kinahan associate to die in the feud. The 31-year-old's body was found by a council worker in an underground car park on Dorset Street. He had been shot in the head as he sat in his Volkswagen Golf. At the beginning of December 2017, Noel Duckegg Kerwin's son Cain was lured to his death by the Kinahans. His body was found in a field on the Meath-Kildare border. He had been shot in the back of the head. He was killed because he had publicly threatened to seek revenge for the murder of his father. No one could predict the level and speed of the murderous reaction to the attack in the Regency Hotel. And as the Regency murder trial got underway in the Special Criminal Court this year, more bloodshed in quick succession served as a stark reminder that this war is far from over.
It's kind of a message, isn't it? You know, we're still going to get you no matter what's happening.
When this feud came to the public attention in the most brutal and violent way possible. But for over 30 years, the Hutch and Kinahan factions have rubbed shoulders in the inner city, and there is a long history between the figureheads of these 2 families.
Christy Kinahan, while he has inhabited a world that is largely made up of working class figures who have come from poverty and seen crime as a means of making a living, Kinahan came from a middle class background, so he's unusual in that way. He grew up in Cabra, was educated. Both his parents had jobs. He somehow in the sort of the late 70s, early 80s, began to notice the money that could be made in drugs and began to move towards that. He's been in and out of prison actually a lot. In his early days when he was in prison, he met up with John Cunningham, the Jennifer Guinness kidnapper, a veteran even at that stage, a former member of Martin Cahill's gang, and a guy with high hopes. Both of them had ambitions. They didn't want to be street dealers, they didn't want to be wholesalers here. They wanted to take a piece of the action out in Europe, and together they moved out to Amsterdam, where they started to wholesale weapons and drugs.
And business was good when in 2010 Spanish and Irish police launched simultaneous raids across 3 European countries, codename Operation Shovel. Christy Kinahan was arrested and over €500 million in assets were seized, still just a fraction of the cartel's wealth.
Gerry Hutch came from a very different background to Christy Kinahan, working class, grew up in the North Inner City, would have started out in crime, running around with a group that were known as the Bugsy Malones. They all very quickly elevated up into, armed robberies and more high-end robberies. He would have always furiously denied any involvement in drugs. I think by the time Gerry Hutch, his nephew, was gunned down in Spain, most people knew that was a myth, that obviously the Hutch faction were involved in drugs and possibly he was overseeing that. He was happily in retirement in Lanzarote, soaking up the sunshine. He didn't really want to get involved in this, but he was drawn back into it. Christy Kinahan appears to have been working constantly towards a certain retirement, and it's around 2016 that you start seeing that Christy Kinahan Sr. has handed the reins of his business over to Daniel. For years he would have had John Cunningham in his ear, not liking the types that Daniel was bringing in to the business. Cunningham thought they were too obvious, they were too careless, and that they were going to bring them all down. I think both Christy Kinahan and Gerry Hutch had a role to play in the build-up to this feud. I think they probably did a deal, and they probably kept their word. I think it was the generation below them that broke that pact. They say there were rules in gangland. They did abide by rules, and the respect of the family elder and the godfather was always part of that. But this new generation of criminals don't seem to have any rules. And really, this feud, this slaughter, is between the generation under them.
In January this year, the much anticipated Regency Hotel trial got underway. Every day, the accused, 25-year-old Patrick Hutch, was escorted under armed guard to and from the court. The prosecution described what happened at the hotel in February 2016 as a resourced, carefully planned, targeted and murderous attack.
The prosecution alleges that all 6 individuals, the driver of the silver transit van, the 3 fake armed Gardaí, the man wearing the blonde wig alleged to be the accused, and the man wearing the flat cap, all took part in a carefully planned murderous attack in the Regency Hotel that day, and it's alleged that they all had a shared intention to commit the offence.
Central to the prosecution's case is this photo. They allege the man dressed as a woman and wielding a gun is Patrick Hutch.
Well, that photograph of a man dressed as a woman carrying a revolver outside the Regency Hotel and the identification of that person in the photograph by 2 Detective Gardaí from Mountjoy is still the subject at the centre of proceedings on day 7 of this trial.
That now iconic photograph, which is at the centre of the Regency Hotel trial, is a photograph that looks like something from the cover of Reservoir Dogs. It's 2 men running from the hotel, both carrying handguns. One is totally not disguised. That's the man known as Flat Cap. All he has on his head is a little flat cap. Kevin Murray, he has subsequently passed away, and perhaps he knew he was going to, and that's why he didn't bother disguising himself. That's always been the kind of the suspicion. But the other is a man dressed in drag, dressed as a woman, and just peeling the wig off his head as he heads towards the getaway vehicle. That man, the state has alleged, is Patrick Hutch.
The defence alleged the Gardaí mishandled the identification, however, calling the process sullied, tainted and unsatisfactory, suggesting that because the accused is a Hutch, there was some bias on the part of the Gardaí. The photograph and the official identification of the person in it very quickly became the reason the trial became marred in delays, and residents of the inner city, hoping for a quick resolution, grew more anxious.
The whole trial has resurrected memories for people and emotions and concerns and maybe feelings that of what happened that day. It's 2 years. Time is a healer, but when you have such a high-profile trial, this can actually resurrect these feelings, and unfortunately a lot of those feelings will be anger and can turn into revenge, and that's what we're hoping doesn't happen, but fearful that it may.
People are rattled, and I think if you want to know the overall sense that I get from people is people are really sad. People are really upset. The community has been devastated by something that is outside of their control. That's a small number of people involved in criminal activity that's bringing this pain to their door.
The pain of losing a loved one was overwhelming for the mother of Derek Coakley Hutch, seen here being comforted by her family just metres from where her son's body lay. Just 9 days after the start of the trial, Coakley Hutch, another nephew of the monk, was shot dead outside Cloverhill prison. It's understood he went to a halting site to throw drugs into the adjacent jail. Just as the efforts of the Gardaí were seeming to yield results, the murder of Coakley Hutch was a stark reminder that the feud was far from over.
Well, there was that feeling that it had abated, and we were getting the news that a lot of attempted murders were being stopped, and the Garda intelligence and the Garda activity was having a major impact. The Derek Hutch in particular sparked not only fear but also the resilience that's in the North Inner City was shown when 600 people, in defiance of whoever and whatever, marched from the Lourdes Church in Sean McDermott Street to the statue or to the monument to those who died in the 80s from drugs. And like 600 people to come out on a wet Thursday evening just proved to me that the North Inner City, the people, they may be down but they're not out, and they're on the way back because they're saying enough is enough. And that not only sent a message to the gangland people that we don't accept that, but also that Gerry Hutch in particular was someone who was trying to change his life around. People knew his mother, they knew his children, knew his partner, and people just wanted to say, there may be fear there, but we're still coming out and we're going to say, we want this to stop.
But it didn't stop, and just days later, after attending the wake of Derek Coakley Hutch, close friend Jason Buddha Molyneux was lured to his death. He was shot 6 times, just a few hundred yards from an armed Garda checkpoint. He had also received official Garda warnings about threats to his life. Officers believe the close associate of the Hutch family may have been killed for that reason, or because of his involvement in a double murder in the capital.
Buddha Molyneux's murder was very daring. It happened, days after his friend was killed. He had just attended the wake. The area was very heavily policed because of all that, and yet his hitman was prepared to meet him, to shoot him dead on a street.
I think the criminals that we're dealing with here are very different criminals to what we were dealing with before. I think that people are pretty reckless. Why people have got to that stage where they're reckless, I don't know. It could be the circumstances they're in. It could also be because they've been getting away with this kind of behaviour for a long time.
There isn't a never-ending amount of hitmen. A lot of people involved in organised crime wouldn't be able to, or wouldn't dream of taking up a gun and ending someone else's life. There are those who will, and in all cases, it's the money that is the attraction, and it's a quick earn, and there's a good chance, I suppose, if you do it right, you'll get away.
It's kind of a message, isn't it? We're still going to get you no matter what's happening. And there's something subliminal about that has told the criminal fraternity that's involved in this that actually, you need to really watch yourself, because even with the guards there, we can still get you.
Buddha Molyneux was shot dead probably a 2 minutes walk from there, where I'm sure that the guards on the checkpoint could hear the shots. But it didn't deter somebody coming out, seeing he was available to be shot and shooting him. So where was the deterrent there?
With the North Inner City in shock over the 2 murders, the trial of Patrick Hutch was about to take another turn.
A number of very poignant tributes were paid to the lead investigator in the Regency Hotel murder case, the late Detective Superintendent Colm Fox, who died in tragic circumstances at Ballymun Garda Station over the weekend. It was with a heavy heart that Sean Gallan, the senior prosecutor in the case, said that he was informing the court of the senior Garda's tragic and sudden passing.
Everyone would have huge sympathy for the family of Colm Fox. I knew him personally. He was an excellent member of the Garda Síochána, did tremendous work in, his record speaks for itself.
The best way to commemorate him and the work he tried to do was to make sure we finished the work, that we addressed the criminal gangs, that we addressed the social, and that's the real contribution we can make to people like him who gave their lives to try and create a better society in Ballymun, in the inner city and in Ireland.
His death followed an application by the defence for access to emails exchanged between the Gardaí involved in the identification process of the man in that photo at the centre of the case, even though the court had ruled that it was admissible. Investigating Gardaí left the criminal courts as the trial was adjourned to allow for an investigation to take place into the circumstances of the death of Colm Fox, after the judges were handed notes written by the Detective Superintendent. While all attention was on the Special Criminal Court, residents of the North Inner City, where the feud is having the greatest impact, still fear for their lives.
There was a child's bedroom in the house. The child wasn't in the bedroom, but they threw a petrol bomb in, didn't light it, but just said, we know where the child is, that's what we can do.
In the North Inner City, the gangs and the community are intrinsically woven together, and the feud has had a devastating effect. Friends, family members and neighbours can find themselves on opposing sides as senior gang members press them into service with insidious intimidation tactics or the allure of easy money. After decades of neglect and poor policy implementation by government, poverty and a lack of opportunity are rife in the inner city, and for some the drug trade offers a means to improve their situation.
You get that sort of hero worship, and they see a guy going around in a nice big car and no apparent means of having that standard of living, and he's flashing money around and he has his new runners, tracksuit, etc. And some kids unfortunately do aspire and criminals are very well aware that that can happen.
A 12-year-old could be asked to look out for the guards. That's how simple this is. And a 12-year-old being asked by an older person who they see with wealth, who they see with status, who they see with power, will a lot of the time just say, oh yeah, okay, and all of a sudden they're involved in something that they're not even aware of what they're involved in.
The illegal drug trade is worth approximately just under €1 billion in the Irish economy alone. So someone out there is controlling €1 billion worth of drugs, and for them to recruit people is quite easy.
If I leave this office now, within minutes I can buy anything from Xanax to heroin to a Glock within probably a half an hour. And there's something fundamentally wrong with that type of society. That shows that there's a huge amount of people being recruited and working actively.
Anybody driving around this area knows where you can go and get drugs. It's omnipresent in some parts of the city.
If Daniel Kinahan arrived in town in the morning, all the young fellas would be flocking around him because he's the man, right? And they all aspire to that. He's their guru. He's their leader, effectively, and they want the trappings of wealth that he has, and they want to be part of that. It's about being part of something. And the state, it doesn't seem to recognise that.
Clearly, it is an issue for young people if they see a drug dealer in the area driving around in a high-powered car. We're trying to get over that, to try and give new pathways open to vulnerable young people and get them to work into the working environment and to develop them and to give them an alternative from moving into that kind of activity and that kind of lifestyle that ultimately ends up in a poor end for them.
Money, power, prestige. People want to be associated with an up-and-coming criminal gang that offers huge rewards. And the attractions are there. The chances of being caught, fairly remote.
There are families who have been, stuck in criminality for some time. Some families that could have been the case, and it's difficult, I suppose, to break that circle, and that's what we're trying to achieve. Alternative pathways need to be developed for young people through education, through support on the ground, and it includes on Garda Síochána by developing a good relationship with them.
These are not stupid people. People make a conscious decision now to go into the drugs trade or some other criminal trade, and it has just as much appeal to them as going to college or finishing their education or becoming a plumber or a plasterer or indeed a solicitor.
Aside from those that make the conscious decision to enter the drug trade, there's a growing trend among inner city gangs to find new recruits among their customers, using fear and intimidation to press addicts with minor drug debts into service.
I know one case in particular where a man has had to sell his house because of his son's drug debt, and what they did there was to prove how serious they were about it. There was a child's bedroom in the house. The child wasn't in the bedroom, but they threw a petrol bomb in, didn't light it, but just said, we know where the child is, that's what we can do. And that's the viciousness and the callousness of these people. And once you're recruited into their army, in inverted commas, there's no way out.
The real intimidation is for the parents of particularly drug addicts who are being attacked and pushed to pay off the debts that their children have incurred, or either their children will be dealt with severely or they themselves will be. And many people have gone to borrow money, for instance, to pay off drug debts. And again, there's a scheme where you can tell the police this, and they'll do something. That doesn't solve it, because it doesn't remove the fact that these people can do what they want.
Directly, I would know 2 people have been asked to carry out hits, or it's been suggested to them if they wanted to make big money quickly, or in one case clear a drug debt quickly, that there is something they could do.
To combat the intimidation and to break the cycle, Gardaí have had to change their strategy to be more inclusive in an attempt to dispel the us and them ethos and establish closer ties with residents. Gardaí are engaged in community policing. It's a popular buzzword, but hardly a new development. In the early 90s, Sergeant John O'Driscoll was policing the inner city. Gerry Hutch was a prominent figure at the time and engaging the community in an effort to stop gang violence and the distribution of drugs was key to the sergeant's strategy.
So what we have tried to do in the particular drug unit that I'm attached to is to get involved with the community and to build up contacts with them. And as a result of that, we have tried to address the problem as it is perceived from the community rather than trying to judge it ourselves and maybe achieving successes which wouldn't really have a real impact on the problem on the ground.
John O'Driscoll is now Assistant Commissioner with responsibility for special crime operations and community engagement.
Community policing has always been a priority for the Garda Síochána, and indeed when I was in charge of a drug unit in Store Street back in the 1990s, a significant number of the people who were recruited into that drug unit were people who had operated as community police people in the various districts throughout the North Inner City. And it was because of their ability to interact in an appropriate way and the empathy that they had shown with regard to the people of the North Inner City and what they were going through, that we saw them as ideal people to assist in dealing with the drugs problem. Community policing must be an approach of all members of the Garda Síochána, not just a small number of people who may be dedicated to that area.
If you talk to members of the public, what they want to see is the uniformed police officer in the high visibility jacket in their area, interacting with them and asking what the issues are and trying to address them and trying to deal with them.
This is a community that are like face to face, so you have within that North Inner City area, which is a very small section of Dublin, you have two sides and they're neighbours. Some of them are living, you know, streets away from their sworn enemies. So while you can't really keep them apart, so a cross word on a street can lead to something way bigger when you're living in that feud environment. So that's really, really difficult to police, and it's also caused a paranoia within the community, and a lot of people have really been told not to trust anybody. I mean, childhood friends and people they went to school with are all of a sudden on the other side of the divide. So it's that proximity that has made it very, very difficult to police.
My understanding is the guards are getting a lot more intelligence and a lot more information, and even at local crime level. In my day, when I was young, if you saw a guard coming down the street, you'd run the other way. Now kids actually know the guard's name. So there's a sea change in the attitude to Gardaí, which has been very, very helpful.
Community policing is really the only way forward, because without the support and involvement of the community, you're not going to achieve very much.
Community policing is a key part of the Garda strategy, but for many in the inner city, their only interaction with Gardaí is with armed guards at checkpoints. It's a method of policing that has drawn sharp criticism.
Garda Síochána is guardians of the peace. We always had policing by consent. How is it by consent when you have to use masked men in body armour to do it? That's not consent. That's enforcing a type of policing and a control over a community.
Young people walking out of their homes and witnessing that in front of them is extremely traumatic. And if that's all the guards have to deal with this, I think that's really, really sad.
To ordinary people becoming accustomed to armed checkpoints, I don't think is a good thing. And I don't think as a free society we should have to be accustomed. Our children shouldn't have to see armed police in masks on the streets.
If the only guards that people see are heavily armed, is that going to inspire confidence? I mean, the Gardaí have to do that because they're dealing with ruthless people. But on the other hand, it is creating a situation of fear, of lack of confidence, of feeling really there's very little we can do, that this is too big for us, for ordinary citizens.
We understand, of course, that the community don't really want to see armed checkpoints. We want to make sure that the community primarily are safe, and the main thing is that we have to be on the streets to do that. We fully accept that young children going to school would, of course, don't want to see that, and families don't want to see that. I would ask the community to bear with us. We want to come to a day when we don't have to do that, and hopefully that won't be too long away.
People are living in fear, People just don't know what could happen next. People could be caught up in crossfire. The wrong people are being shot. But is that what we want for our children? Children who grow up in an area should be proud of the area they come from. And they're finding their area is being presented day after day as Wild West.
I think that we need a more strategic approach. We need intelligence. We need specialists in here. We need to look at other countries that have dealt with situations like this and bring the expertise in.
The British police, for instance, haven't allowed one crime gang to take control of a city. Nor would, any other police force. And if you look at the level of murders in this country by criminal gangs, it exceeds New York, London, Manchester, any area with similar problems.
You would question, if this was Blackrock, would this have gone on this long? I don't know. I fear it wouldn't.
The Garda crackdown on those involved in this feud has yielded results, but there's no end in sight, and those impacted are losing hope, wondering what it will take to stop the bloodshed.
We may never see Gerry Hutch again, but at the same time, I do think he's still out there and he's still a threat.
To date, there have been 14 murders. 12 Hutch family members or associates have lost their lives, compared to 2 Kinahan gang members. Many killed in broad daylight on the streets of the inner city. But as Gardaí and gangland figures wage a very public battle on the streets of the inner city, elsewhere the feud rages away from the public eye. What's happening on the outside continues inside the prison system. Just because gang members are behind bars doesn't mean that their activities cease.
Gangs have been around the Irish Prison Service for the last 3 decades. And 10 years ago we would have had a high number of gangs, and they come and go. Gangs are a persistent, disruptive force within the prison service, and they erode the quality of life for everybody within the prison environment, staff and prisoners alike. So we have a range of measures we do to actually group people together, because what we don't want is we don't want them to have undue influence within the prison environment. We have to suppress the power of gangs by segregating them from the general population, by restricting their regime in terms of who they mix with and what they do, and also by transferring people from prison to prison.
Mountjoy was traditionally sort of a north inner city prison. It was kind of supposedly controlled at one stage by the associates of the Hutches. It has now been won by the Kinahan cartel, and the Hutches have actually been moved out of it. I mean, the situation is that serious that they've had to completely separate them into completely different buildings.
We'd never say they run the prisons, but they are becoming a very powerful force. Obviously, they use their power and influence on the drug trade within the prisons. And from that, we have been calling for the support from management that we believe we required.
And support is desperately needed. Mountjoy Prison alone houses over 30 members of the Kinahan gang at the moment, and around 230 prisoners are on protection in this jail at any one time. The demand for protection for inmates has increased tenfold over the past 10 years. Since the feud began here in early 2016, there's also been a major increase in the demand for armed Gardaí units to escort prisoners being transferred for court appearances or trials. Approved requests for such high security escorts have increased by a massive 66% since 2015.
Once somebody goes to prison, it doesn't mean that they stop being a criminal. Some may, under rehabilitation, they may develop different techniques of dealing with the urges that they have, but for others, they can cement their status as a criminal gang member. They can set up stuff to happen outside of the prison from within the prison.
And for gangs to operate from within the prison, they need to be able to communicate with the outside.
Mobile phones now are very small plastic type items that are very hard to detect, but we are successful in ensuring that we're disrupting that.
If you look at nowadays the way technology has gone and how small a mobile phone can be, therefore a criminal gang in prison can smuggle in a mobile phone and they can keep in contact with their colleagues in the outside world in their criminal gang, so they can run their their criminal empire. It's known, it's being proven, it's being highlighted in the media.
They're almost enabled by our prison system. They're held together, a lot of them. There doesn't seem to be a commitment to crack down on phone usage in prisons.
They will use the mobile phone for criminality if they can get it into prison, and that will involve anything from very serious crime like you've just organised to obviously trying to get drugs into the prison. While
they seize phones every now and then, they're using phones, and a simple blocking device around the prison could disable the ability for any of them to be using their phones. And the fact of the matter is, they're not using the phones to ring home, they're using the phones to organise murder, to organise drug deals, and to keep their business going.
Despite dozens of gang members in prison, gangland activity continues, but intense pressure by the Gardaí is yielding results. Officers from the Drugs and Organised Crime Bureau have intercepted well over 50 murders directly connected to the feud since it began here in 2016. Around 25 lives were saved last year and 8 so far this year. They've seized over €130 million worth of drugs and €6 million in cash. Over 80 high-powered firearms have been uncovered during various operations targeting those involved in the feud, and over 3,000 rounds of ammunition have been seized. And in March this year, Gardaí swooped on a group of Kinahan gunmen as they prepared to carry out a hit on Gerry the Monk Hutch's brother Patsy Hutch. Days later, another Hutch relative was targeted, and again Gardaí intervened before the gunmen could carry out the killing. Jonathan Hutch was the target. This was the second time he was targeted. The first was in Spain when Trevor O'Neill was killed in front of his family in a case of mistaken identity. And back in Spain, the killing that ignited this feud, the murder of Gerry Hutch, concluded before the courts. Dublin man James Quinn, who would have been close to the Kinahans and the Hutches, was arrested on the Costa del Sol and charged with murdering the monk's nephew. Quinn's arrest came as Gardaí, working with officers from Guardia Civil in Spain, carried out a number of search operations in Dublin and on the Costa del Sol. Quinn, a childhood friend of Daniel Kinahan, was once close to his victim Gerry Hutch, and he had strong links to the Kinahan cartel, who he'd been working for some time. He stood trial in a Malaga court in June, and the court heard he denied any involvement in the murder, claiming he was in bed, hungover with a prostitute, when Gerry Hutch was shot dead. The jury convicted him of murder, finding that he drove the getaway car and stating that they couldn't conclude that he was the gunman. He was sentenced to 22 years. And as the Gardaí and gang leaders wrestle for control of the inner city, residents are left asking, where will it end?
We'd love a normal life in the North Inner City. We don't see a prospect of that in the immediate future, but we want to work towards that, and the community really, that's what they want, and that's what they want, that's what they desire, and that's what they deserve.
I'm afraid this is just too big now of a business, and it's too embedded. I have an emotional attachment as a Dubliner, that I would not like Dublin to go this way. I was born in inner city Dublin, which was a place where people looked after one another, people helped one another. There was a great sense of solidarity. There was criminality, but this organised crime is something completely new, something that didn't exist before. And it's the fruit of greed. It's the fruit of lack of conscience, and I can see that. It's destroying people's lives.
These gangs pose a bigger threat to the security of the state than all of the Republican and Loyalist paramilitary groupings together ever did. Because these people are destroying a generation. And unless we wake up to that fact, and unless the state decides that it's actively going to deal with it, then, we've lost.
There's no doubt but that this feud will go on and on and on. I do not know where Gerry Hutch is. I do know that he has a lot of money, he's a lot of resources, and he's an ability to sit back and sit offside. I believe that he will never return here to Ireland, and we may never see Gerry Hutch again. But at the same time, I do think he's still out there and he's still a threat. My understanding is that Christy Kinahan has no longer any control over Daniel and has pretty much washed his hands with him. There's no doubt but the Kinahan cartel is coming undone. You have the head of it, now Daniel Kinahan, in exile in Dubai, unable to return to Europe. It might take another few years, but the Kinahan cartel is most certainly going to be something of the past. From the Hutch's point of view, the only move they can now make is to yet again try and take the head off the snake, because that's the only thing that's going to stop this slaughter.